The light was going fast the way it goes near the equator, without warning, the sky bleeding from copper to slate in a matter of minutes, when the officer of the watch on the afterdeck lowered his glass, then raised it again, then called for the captain in a voice that the men would later describe as unusually flat. Off the starboard bow, where a moment before there had been only the long swell of the South Atlantic rolling black and unbroken, something had risen out of the water. Not spray, not a wave, a shape. It came up head first, dark and glistening, water sheeting off it in the last light, and it kept coming, higher than a man would think possible, until a column of neck stood clear of the surface and held there, steady against the motion of the sea, as if it were bolted to the deep. Picture it as they saw it, because they saw it for a long time, and they saw it well. The head was not the blunt round head of a seal or the flat wedge of a shark. It was elongated, something between a horse and a serpent, the mouth a hard dark line, and behind the skull, running down the back of the neck, there was a kind of mane, not hair exactly. The men who wrote it down struggled for the word. Something like seaweed, some said, a dark fringe or crest that lay wet against the neck and stirred when the creature moved. The body behind it was thicker than a barrel, a deep brownish black on top, fading to a yellowish white beneath the throat, and it did not thrash. That was the thing that unsettled the trained navigators standing at the rail. It did not writhe or splash or fight the water. It moved through the swell with a terrible economy, a straight, steady progress, the way a thing moves when it has somewhere to be. And it came toward the ship. This was a British warship, a sailing corvette on the long passage home, a vessel crewed by men who had spent years at sea and had seen whales sound and breach, had seen basking sharks, porpoises, sunfish, the great pale drifting jellyfish, every ordinary marvel the ocean offers up to men who live on it. These were not passengers prone to fright. They were professionals whose entire craft depended on reading the surface of the water correctly, on knowing at a glance what was a wave and what was a whale and what was a trick of the failing light. And every one of them who stood at that rail in the last 20 minutes of daylight would afterward set his name to the same impossible account. The creature closed the distance and did not dive. It drew up alongside the bow, and for a moment its full length lay revealed along the surface, parallel to the hull, and the men could measure it against the one thing they knew precisely, their own ship. 60 feet of it. Some said more. A length of animal that ran the better part of the ship's own waterline, a living cable of muscle laid out on the darkening sea, and where it met the bow, it began, slowly, to bend, to curve inward, to coil against the wood. Think about what that means. A frightened animal flees, a curious animal circles and keeps its distance. This thing came to the hull and held station there, its dark flank almost touching the planking, riding the same swell as the ship, as though it had decided to keep pace, as though the great wooden vessel with its 100 and more souls aboard were something it had chosen rather than something it wished to escape. Men leaned over the rail and looked down at it. And here is the detail that the officers returned to again and again, the detail that turned a strange sighting into something none of them could sleep easily after. It looked back. The eyes were visible, dark, wet, set into that long, strange head, and they were not the blank, glassy eyes of a fish. The men swore the head turned, that it tracked them, that as they moved along the rail, the eye followed, taking them in, one face and then another, with an attention that was patient and cold and entirely aware. Whatever it was, it knew the ship was full of watching things, and it studied them back. For 20 minutes, by the estimate of the officer holding the watch, this went on. 20 minutes is not a glimpse. 20 minutes is not a shape half seen in fog that the mind fills in with its own fears. 20 minutes at close range, in enough light to make out colour and texture and the movement of an eye, observed by men whose profession was accurate observation. Nobody aboard reached for a harpoon. That is its own kind of testimony. On a ship of that era, a strange animal at the surface was meat, oil, a specimen, a trophy, a story to sell in port, and yet not one man in that account moved to strike it. Whether it was awe or dread or some older instinct that told them not to provoke the thing coiled at their bow, they simply watched, and it watched them, and the sea grew darker around the two of them, the warship and the Serpent, holding together on the swell as the last of the copper light drained out of the west. The captain stood at the rail with his glass and gave, later, the flattest and most careful description of all, the description of a man determined to record only what his eyes reported and nothing his imagination added. He noted the length against the ship. He noted the diameter of the body. He noted the colour above and below, the absence of any visible undulation driving it forward, which puzzled him more than anything, for the thing moved without the vertical porpoising of a mammal or the side-to-side sweep of a great fish. He noted the head, the mane, the eye, and he noted the one fact that no natural history known to him could accommodate, that it did not behave like prey, and it did not behave like a predator hunting. It behaved like something keeping company. Then, as full night came on, and the men could no longer be certain what they were seeing, the shape uncoiled from the bow, sank its head slowly back toward the surface, and drew off into the dark on the same steady course it had come, and the black water closed over the place where it had been as though nothing had ever risen there at all. The officer of the watch marked the time. The captain went below, and somewhere in the small hours, by the swinging light of a lamp, he opened the ship's log and picked up his pen, and began, in the plain, unhurried hand of a Royal Navy officer, to write down the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. The captain was Peter McCuhay, master and commander of Her Majesty's frigate Daedalus, and the log he opened that night has a date on it that you can read for yourself. The 6th of August, 1848. The position was southwest of the coast of West Africa, some 300 miles off the mouth of the great rivers, on the long homeward passage from the East Indies. He wrote the bearing, the weather, the state of the sea. And then, in the same measured hand, without exclamation, without the flourish of a man reaching for wonder, he set down that the ship had been passed close aboard by an enormous Serpent, and he gave its length as upward of 60 feet visible above the water, and its head and shoulders as held constantly some 4 feet clear of the surface. 60 feet, longer than the main deck of a naval frigate. He wrote that there was no perceptible motion of the body by which it drove itself, that it passed with great rapidity, and that had it been a man he knew, a shipmate, he could not have distinguished the features more clearly at the distance it kept. That is the sentence I keep returning to. Not the length, not the mane, not the dark, glistening back. That one line, that had it been a friend, he would have known the face, because it tells you the range. It tells you this was not a smudge on the horizon glimpsed for a heartbeat through spray. This was a thing held under the eyes of trained navigators, men whose entire professional worth was measured by their ability to judge distance and size and speed across water in failing light, and they had it in full view, close aboard, for something on the order of 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Consider what that number does to every easy explanation. A trick of the light lasts a moment. A wave mistaken for a back resolves itself the instant you steady your glass on it. A floating log rolls, or it does not, and either way, the mind corrects within seconds. But 20 minutes is not a glimpse. 20 minutes is an observation. 20 minutes is long enough for 7 men to point, to argue, to fetch a glass, to call the captain up from below, to watch the head turn, to see the eye move, to note the mane streaming and the water parting and the absence of any wake such a body ought to have thrown, long enough to be sure. And every man on that deck who was asked afterward said the same thing in the same order with the same details. That is not how hoaxes hold together. Hoaxes fray at the edges. This one did not fray. When the Daedalus made Plymouth in early October, the story did not stay aboard. It never does. Word of a sea serpent seen by a Queen's ship ran through the port and into the London papers within days, and by the 9th of October the account had reached the desk of the Admiralty itself. And here is where the affair turns from a sailor's yarn into something that had to be answered, because the Admiralty did not laugh it off. Sir Francis Beaufort, the same Beaufort whose name is on the wind scale you were taught as a child, was the hydrographer of the Navy, and it was through his office that the request came down. Captain McQuay was asked, in effect, to put his name to it in public, to confirm or deny, to let the matter be settled by a gentleman and an officer. He did not deny it. On the 11th of October, from Devonport, McQuay wrote a full and formal report, addressed to the Admiralty and released to the press, and it was printed in the Times, and it carried with it a drawing made under his direction, the Serpent lifted above the sea, the ship small in the background, the long dark body trailing away astern. A post-captain of the Royal Navy, a man with a career to lose and nothing on earth to gain, staked his name and his reputation on the record in the most public forum his country possessed. He named the officers who had seen it. Lieutenant Edgar Drummond, who kept his own private account in his journal and whose entry agrees with his captain's in every particular that matters. The master, the midshipman of the watch, the quartermaster at the wheel. 7 witnesses, all of them men whose living depended on telling the truth about what they saw at sea, all of them saying the same impossible thing. And for a few weeks, the country believed them. The illustrated papers ran the image. Drawing rooms talked of nothing else. A serpent longer than a warship, maned like a horse, that had risen beside a Queen's ship and kept pace with her and looked her officers in the eye. It was, for that autumn, the most famous animal in the world. Then the tide went the other way, and it went out quickly, and it went out from a single direction. Richard Owen, the most powerful naturalist in Britain, the man who would coin the word dinosaur, the anatomist whose word carried the weight of the whole scientific establishment, took up his pen against it. He did not go to sea. He did not interview the witnesses. He sat in London with the printed account, and he explained, with enormous authority and considerable condescension, that what the officers of the Daedalus had seen was not a serpent at all, but very probably a large seal or a sea lion out of its normal range, its head mistaken for a monster by men whose imaginations had run ahead of their eyes. It was more probable, Owen wrote, that men should be deceived than that a creature unknown to science should exist, and that single principle, that the impossibility of the animal was itself the proof that the witnesses were wrong, was the coffin, and Owen nailed it shut. McQuay answered him. He answered him well, in print, with the cold, contained anger of a professional who has been told by a man who was not there that he cannot tell a serpent from a seal. He pointed out that he had watched the thing for 20 minutes at a cable's length, that he knew perfectly well what a seal looked like, that no seal on earth was 60 feet long or held its head 4 feet above the water on a neck without diving, and that he stood by every word. He was right on the facts, and it did not matter, because Owen was the institution and McQuay was only a witness, and when an institution and a witness disagree, the record keeps the institution. And so, quietly, the thing began to be unwritten, not denied outright. Denial would have required engaging with those 7 consistent men, simply set aside, filed under the credulity of sailors, mentioned, when it was mentioned at all, as a curiosity of the age of steam, a charming error, the sort of thing serious men had grown out of. The drawing survived. The Times columns survived, and you can find them still. But the creature itself was lifted out of natural history as cleanly as it had sunk back beneath the water off the African coast, and the men who had sworn to it were left holding a truth that the science of their century had decided it would not receive. I spent 3 weeks trying to follow the paper past that point, and every trail I took ended the same way, not in a contradiction, but in an absence. There is a version of this story in which the record simply thins out because nothing more happened. That is not what happened here. What happened here is that the fuller account, the one McQuay himself referred to, the detailed navigational notes and the supplementary observations taken by his officers, never surfaced in any archive I could reach. The Daedalus reached the Thames on the 4th of October, 1848. Her log was submitted to the Admiralty in the ordinary way, as every log was. And the summary that reached the newspapers, the letter Makuhai wrote at the direct request of his superior officer, Admiral Sir Charles Adam, was clearly a condensed thing, a captain writing for the public, distilling what must have been pages of working notes into a single careful column. Those working notes are what I wanted, the bearings taken minute by minute, the sketches the Lieutenant Edgar Drummond made in his private journal, because Drummond did keep a journal and he did draw the animal, and fragments of that journal were quoted in the years afterward, which means it existed, which means someone held it. And yet when you go looking for the complete document, for the whole of what the men of the Daedalus set down while the memory was still hot, you find quotation without source, reference without object. It is cited, and it is gone. I am not telling you it was seized. I am telling you that a thing which plainly existed cannot now be laid on a table, and that the difference between suppression and neglect, from where we stand, is a difference you cannot see. And the witnesses. 7 men saw it clearly, McQuay wrote, and more felt it. But watch what happens to 7 men across the following decade. McQuay defended himself once, in print, with dignity, and then he stopped. He did not tour. He did not write a book, though a book would have sold in the tens of thousands. He went back to sea, served out his career, and by every account never again volunteered a word about the thing beside his bow unless he was asked directly, and often not even then. A man does not go silent about the most extraordinary thing he ever saw because he has stopped believing it. He goes silent because he has learned what it costs him to say it aloud. Owen taught him that. The reviews taught him that. The quiet smiles in the wardrooms of better-connected men taught him that. The others followed him into the silence one by one. Drummond's journal was mentioned, then not mentioned. The other officers, named in no public letter, protected by that anonymity, simply never came forward. And who can blame them, having watched their captain, a man of rank and unimpeachable record, be gently instructed by the foremost anatomist in the empire that he had mistaken a seal for a monster. If that could be done to McQuay, it could be done to anyone. So the 7 became one, and the one became none. And within 20 years, the standard reference to the Daedalus Serpent was not the testimony of the men who saw it, but the explanation of the man who did not. That explanation, I have to give its due, because a serious account owes the skeptic his best case, and Owen's was not the only one. There were 2 ordinary answers offered for what coiled against that hull, and I have turned both over for a long time. The first is the seaweed. Along that stretch of the South Atlantic, great ribbons of detached kelp and sargassum drift on the surface currents, dark, glistening, sometimes 50 and 60 feet long, and in a heavy swell, such a raft rises and falls and writhes in a way that can, from a moving deck at dusk, counterfeit a living body. I find that persuasive for a great many sea serpent reports. Drifting weed has fooled good sailors before and will again. It explains the dark colour, the length, the something behind the neck they took for a mane. But it does not explain the head held 4 feet clear of the water on a rigid neck, steady for 20 minutes against the wind. Weed does not hold its head up. Weed goes where the water goes. And the men of the Daedalus were explicit and consistent to the last, that this thing moved contrary to the sea, that it drove forward on a straight course at some 12 or 15 miles an hour, with no undulation of the body to drive it, passing so close under the quarter that had it been a man of their acquaintance, McQuay wrote, they should have recognized his features with the naked eye. Weed does not choose a heading. This thing had a heading. The second answer is Owen's own, refined by those who came after him, a large marine mammal out of its range, a seal or a sea lion or, in the gentler modern versions, a whale. Its exhalation and its rolling back read as a manned serpent by primed and frightened eyes. And I concede at once what it explains. It explains a warm-blooded animal at the surface. It explains a dark, glistening body. It explains why the thing did not behave like a fish. But no seal is 60 feet long. No sea lion carries its head 1.5 yards above the water on a neck for 1/3 of an hour without once diving to breathe or feed. And whales, when a warship bears down on them, sound. They go down. That is the whole of a whale's instinct in the presence of a hull, to put water between itself and the thing. This animal did the opposite. This animal came to the ship. And that is the thing no logbook answered, and the reason I could not let this one go. Strip away Owen and the missing notes and the silenced men, and set aside for one moment the question of what species it belonged to, and you are still left standing on that quarterdeck with the plain fact of its behavior. It did not flee. A creature large enough to have nothing on earth to fear and cautious enough to have survived to that size in an ocean full of ships, chose deliberately on a steady heading, with eyes that the men swore tracked them along the rail, to close with 150 feet of armed British timber and hold station against her bow. Not attack, not feed, not pass, hold. As though the ship were the interesting thing, as though it had come up out of the dark to look at us exactly as we were looking at it. So I return, where I always return, to that last image before the water took it back. The dark coil against the hull in the failing light, the manned neck, the head turned toward the deck, the 20 minutes in which 7 men and 150 tons of warship were the observed and not the observers. And I ask the one question that Owen never had to answer, that the seaweed and the sea lion never touch, that McQuay carried silent to the end of his career and, I suspect, to the end of his life. It did not come up to hunt. It did not come up to flee. What was it waiting for, there beside the bow, in the moment before it let itself sink, and chose the whole of the deep ocean over 1 more minute in the company of men? I have sat with that question for the better part of a year, and I want to be honest with you about what it does to a person. You begin by wanting an animal. You want a species, a name in italics, a place in the ladder of things that swim. That is the respectable want, the one that lets you sleep. But the deeper you go into the Daedalus material, into the 6 columns the Times gave it in October of 1848, into McQuay's own hand, into the terse official reply the Admiralty allowed to be printed, and the far longer conversations that were never allowed to be printed at all, the more the animal recedes and the behavior remains. And the behavior is the part that will not dissolve. You can lose a species to time, you can lose a carcass to the sea, but you cannot lose the shape of a decision, and what those 7 men witnessed for 20 minutes was a decision. Consider what it costs a wild thing to make that choice. Everything alive in the deep ocean has been shaped by a single unbroken lesson, taught over 100 million years by every larger mouth that ever closed on something smaller, that the unknown large moving object is death, and the correct answer to it is distance. That lesson is not learned, it is inherited. It is written into the nerve before the eye has focused. A basking shark feels the pressure wave of a hull and turns. A sperm whale, the largest predator that has ever lived, hears the screw and goes to the black. Nothing survives to great size in that ocean by being curious about ships. Curiosity is the first thing the ocean kills. And yet here, off the coast of Africa, in the last grey light of the 8th of August, something enormous and old and cautious enough to have grown enormous suspended that entire inheritance, held it in abeyance, and did the forbidden thing. It approached. It closed the distance the whole of its lineage had spent an eternity learning to keep. I keep coming back to the eyes. In every account that survives, Sartoris's first cry, Drummond's private diary, McQuay's letter, the detail that no witness would surrender under any pressure was that the creature looked at them. Not the blind slide of a fish along a hull, not the panicked roll of a stranded thing. It tracked. The head, they said, was carried steadily above the surface, and it turned and it followed the line of the deck as though counting the men at the rail. That is the detail Owen most needed to erase, because a swimming carcass cannot look at you, and a strand of kelp has no eye, and he knew it, and so in his long correction to the Times, he simply did not engage with it. He explained the body and left the gaze alone. And I have read that correction perhaps 40 times now, and I have come to believe that the silence around the eyes is the most honest thing in it, the place where the greatest comparative anatomist of the age reached the edge of what he was willing to say in print and stopped. Because there are only a few reasons a creature crosses that inherited line and comes to a ship. It comes to feed, and this one did not feed. It comes to threaten a rival or a nest, and there was no rival and no nest, only timber and frightened men. Or it comes because something in it, and I can find no gentle word for this, because something in it wanted to see. And that is the possibility the whole apparatus of respectable science was built in that century to make unspeakable. Not that a large unknown animal existed, the sea was still full of those, but that a large unknown animal might have looked back at us with something behind the eye that recognized us as worth the risk of looking. That is the thought Owen buried. That is the thought McQuay carried in silence up the ladder of his rank and into his grave. And that is the thought that no drifting weed and no wandering seal has ever once had to answer for. And so the erasure, when it came, did not need a conspiracy, and I want to leave you with how quietly it worked, because the quiet is the whole lesson. No one burned the log. No one threatened the captain. A senior scientist wrote a plausible letter to a newspaper, and the newspaper printed it, and the thing was reclassified, from event to error, from testimony to anecdote, from something 7 trained navigators saw to something a credulous sailor thought he saw. The fuller notes were simply not asked for, and then not kept, and then not findable. The junior officers grew older and learned what a naval career costs a man who insists on the sea serpent, and they fell silent one by one, not because they were told to, but because they understood. And within a generation, the whole encounter had become what it is today, a colourful footnote, a Victorian curiosity, the sort of thing you smile at. That is how a thing vanishes without anyone deciding to make it vanish. Not with fire, with embarrassment, with the slow social pressure that teaches a man it is safer to have been mistaken than to have been right about the impossible. I cannot give you the animal. I want to be plain about that at the end because you deserve the same honesty I have tried to hold to throughout. I cannot put a name in italics under the dark coil against the Daedalus's bow. The species, whatever it was, took itself back into the deep on the evening of the 8th of August, 1848, and in 176 years the ocean has not once offered it up again. No carcass, no bone, no second unimpeachable deck to stand on. The steelmen are not fools. A whale seen wrong in bad light is a real thing that happens. Kelp does drift in serpent lengths. I have conceded all of it, and I concede it still. But not one of those explanations has ever answered the only question that matters, the one McQuay answered by staying silent and Owen answered by looking away. So I return, one last time, to that quarterdeck in the failing light, to the dark, glistening body pressed along the hull, the mane streaming from the neck, the head lifted and turned toward the rail, and the 7 men who for 20 full minutes were not the watchers, but the watched. It came up out of the black. It crossed the one line its whole ancient nature forbade it to cross. It held station against the bow of a warship, and it looked at the men, and then, when it had seen whatever it came to see, it let itself sink, and it chose the entire lightless weight of the ocean over 1 more minute in our company. What was it waiting for, there beside the bow, in the moment before it went down?